The road stretched on forever, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the late summer haze, framed by dunes that shimmered under the weight of an unforgiving sun. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her fingers sliding along the worn leather edge of the armrest, her gaze wandering to the fleeting glimpses of the Atlantic beyond the sand dunes. The car, a sleek silver sedan smelling of new upholstery and ambition, hummed softly, a mechanical counterpoint to the silence that hung between her and Josh. She glanced at him sideways. His jaw was tense, his eyes glued to the road, one hand on the wheel, the other clutching his phone, his thumb sliding across the screen, flipping through emails with a rhythm like a pulse. He hadn't spoken for almost an hour since they'd left the city behind, trading the concrete canyons of Manhattan for the open, windswept promise of Montauk. Emma shifted, awkwardly tugging at the hem of her light linen sundress, which had gotten caught in her seat belt buckle. The material rustled softly, like the pages of a forgotten book, and the involuntary movement reminded her how long it had been since they had been close. She stole a glance at him, at his profile, illuminated by the bluish light from his phone screen, and tried to piece together the words that had been swirling around in her head for weeks, if not months. Words full of doubt and hope, confusion and desire. They had come here to make things right, hadn't they? To shake off the accumulated dust of misunderstandings, to re-stitch the frayed edges of their marriage like an old but beloved shirt that was too sad to throw away. To remember how once everything had seemed simple. One touch, one look, and her heart would beat faster at the mere sound of his voice. But now she felt a familiar, heavy sensation growing in her chest, a tightness that felt like suffocation, not from lack of oxygen, but from lack of reciprocity. His attention was again far away, riveted to the flickering screen. It seemed as if his entire inner world had been contained within a few inches of light, and there was no place or form for her in that world. Emma turned to the window. The landscape beyond the glass was elusive, alien, but serene, and there was something painfully offensive in that serenity, as if life itself were going on around her, not noticing how her own was slowly falling apart at the seams. Her fingers tightened on the fabric of her dress. She was no longer sure that words, even the best ones, could bring her back from this transparent, soundless shadow. She was disappearing, gradually but inexorably, and it seemed that he did not even notice. "Josh," she said quietly, her voice barely breaking through the hum of the engine. "Do you think we'll see whales? They migrate this time of year, right?" He glanced at her, his brown eyes catching the sunlight for a moment before returning to the road. "Whales? Maybe. I don't know, Em. I'm not sure we'll have time for that." His tone was kind but clipped, the kindness that seemed like an afterthought. He tapped his phone again, the screen lighting up with another email, and Emma felt the hurt deepen, spreading like ink in water. She turned to the window, watching the dunes give way to glimpses of the ocean, its surface glittering like broken glass. Montauk had been her idea, a spontaneous escape, a desperate attempt to reclaim something she couldn't name. She'd spent hours poring over websites, scrolling through photos of wind-beaten cottages and windswept beaches, imagining them walking hand in hand, laughing like they used to when they were younger, when love had felt like a current too strong to resist. But now, sitting next to him, she wondered if she'd been naive to think that a weekend away could heal what had been eroding for years. The car slowed as they approached the outskirts of Montauk, the road narrowing into a charming, salt-pocked town. Boutiques with sea-facing windows and cafes spilling onto the sidewalks flashed past the window, their charm muted by the tension in the cabin. Emma's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag, a canvas tote filled with books she hoped would distract her from the growing gulf between them. She'd brought poetry Rilke, Neruda, hoping the words would stir something in her, remind her of the woman she'd been before the routine of their lives had worn her away. "There it is," Josh said, breaking the silence, nodding toward the sign half hidden by the seagrass driftwood inn. The name was carved in faded white paint, the swirls of the letters suggesting romance and abandonment. The inn itself came into view as they rounded the bend, a sprawling clapboard building perched on a low bluff above the ocean. Its windows glinted in the late afternoon light, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly, as if bowing under the weight of years spent battling the salt air. The place was beautiful in a melancholy way, as if it held secrets in its creaking floorboards. Josh pulled onto the gravel drive, tires crunching softly, and killed the engine. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant roar of the waves and the cry of a gull circling overhead. Emma opened the door, stepping out into air that smelled of salt and possibility. She stretched, her body stiff from the long drive, and let her gaze drift to the horizon, where the ocean met the sky in a thin, trembling line. She took a deep breath, trying to capture the promise of a new beginning in this place. The inn looked just like the photos she'd found online, secluded, almost mystical in its isolation. Wooden steps led from a gravel path to a veranda with battered wicker chairs and a lonely hammock swaying in the corner, as if inviting her to the rest she craved. But even here, in this corner that was supposed to be their sanctuary, she felt the shadow of their discord following her like a ghost. Josh got out of the car, stretched his shoulders, and slammed the door with a little more force than necessary, not angrily, but enough that the sound resonated in Emma's chest like a thud. He walked around the car without looking at her and opened the trunk, taking out their bags. His movements were quick, almost mechanical, like a man who thought in tasks rather than moments. He didn't even look up as he paused for a second to check the screen of his phone before silently tucking it back into his pocket. Emma looked at him as if trying to discern in him the man she had once known down to the smallest detail. His dark hair had become slightly disheveled in the wind and fallen over his forehead. She had once lifted those strands with her fingers, kissed the line of his temple, laughed when he winced from being tickled. She loved the way he frowned, lost in thought, the way he tilted his head when listening to music, the way his smile easy, sincere could light up a room and her from within. Now it all seemed like fragments from an old dream, blurry and uncertain, like photographs faded by the sun. There was still love in those memories, but in reality, between them, it was as if there was a layer of glass, transparent but insurmountable. She felt a strange, almost painful loneliness growing inside her. Standing just a few meters away from him, she felt as if the distance between them not physical, but something much deeper had grown to the size of an entire world, and that perhaps she had already forgotten the way back to him. "Let's go check in," he said, his voice soft but weary, as if even this trip was just one more task on his endless to-do list. He picked up their bags, and together they walked up the steps to the entrance. The inn door was heavy oak with a tarnished brass handle, and when Emma pushed it open, a bell above the door jingled, announcing their arrival. Inside, the scent of old wood and lavender, mingled with the faint scent of the sea, greeted them. The lobby was small but cozy, with a worn Persian rug and a reception desk manned by a woman in her 50s, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were shrewd, as if she'd seen dozens of couples like Emma and Josh come here seeking refuge. "Welcome to Driftwood Inn," she said, her voice soft, with a slight accent that Emma couldn't quite place. "You must be Mr. and Mrs. Wilson." "Yeah," Josh said, putting his bags on the floor and taking out his wallet. "We booked a room for the weekend." The woman, her badge, Reed Marge, nodded and began typing on the old computer, her fingers moving with astonishing dexterity. Emma stood nearby, her gaze sliding around the room, to the walls adorned with faded photographs of lighthouses and storms, to the fireplace where the logs crackled despite the warm weather. There was something soothing yet unsettling about this place, as if it knew more than it let on. "Your room is on the second floor, with a view of the ocean," Marge said, handing Josh a key with a wooden keychain with a starfish carved into it. "Dinner is served at 7 if you'd like to join us. Nothing fancy, but everything is fresh and local." "Thank you," Emma said, her voice quieter than she'd expected. She took the key, her fingers brushing the cool wood, and for a moment she imagined it opening not just the door to their room, but something more, a door to the intimacy she so desperately wanted back. They climbed a narrow staircase, the walls of which were paneled in wood, darkened by age. Their room was at the end of the hallway, a spacious room with a four-poster bed covered in a faded bedspread and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. Emma walked to the window, her breath catching at the sight of the waves crashing against the rocks below. The sky was already turning pink, heralding the sunset, and she felt a wisp of hope, thin as a spider's web, stir in her chest. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, turning to Josh. Her voice was a little quieter than she intended, as if the words were hesitant to come out. He was already unpacking his bag, laying out his laptop, cables, and adapters on a small desk overlooking the ocean. Everything was happening so casually, as if they had come not to save their relationship, but on a regular business trip. "Yeah, not bad," he muttered, not looking up. His phone beeped again. Josh reached for it automatically, frowned, and quickly scrolled through the screen. "Sorry, Em, I have to answer an email. It won't be long." Emma nodded, the lump in her throat rising instantly, heavy and bitter. She said nothing, only walked slowly to the window. The clear glass revealed a view of the ocean, smooth, blue, endless. The waves rolled gently toward the shore, in the same rhythm that her thoughts seemed to beat. One, two, and then emptiness again. "I just thought," she said finally, still looking at the horizon, "that maybe we could just be together for a little while. No work, no screens, just you and me." A light sigh was heard behind him. Not irritation, but rather fatigue. Um, I understand, really. But if I don't answer now, I'll be in trouble tomorrow. We just got here. We'll have time." "When, Josh?" She turned to him, her voice soft but tinged with barely contained pain. "Tomorrow, in a week. When are you going to get this all sorted out, finally clean it up? Because I've been waiting for the time for months now, and it never comes." He froze, still holding the phone in his hand. For the first time all evening, he really looked at her. There was a flicker of regret or irritation in his gaze, but he didn't say anything. Emma looked down. "You know, I used to dream about this house by the ocean. I thought that if we ever came together, everything would become easier. Just to be together, without reasons, without fuss." She looked out at the sea again. "And now I stand here, and feel nothing but silence." Dusk fell over Montauk like a heavy velvet curtain, slowly enveloping the town in deep blue. The wind, still lazy and warm this morning, was now gathering strength, humming outside the windows driftwood in and the salty taste of a gathering storm. Emma stood at the window of their room, her fingers still touching the cool glass, her gaze lost in the restless dance of the waves as they crashed against the rocks with increasing fury. The sky, a rosy sunset an hour ago, was now dark, covered with heavy clouds that curled like smoke from a campfire. The radio in the hotel lobby was warning of an approaching hurricane, which was expected to cut off Montauk from the outside world for the next day or more. Roads were already being closed, ferries had been canceled, and the town seemed to be holding its breath, awaiting the storm. Emma turned as Josh slammed the lid of his laptop shut. He was sitting at his desk, his face illuminated by the soft light of his desk lamp, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago firm, but with a soft smile that promised her the world. But that smile was less and less frequent now, replaced by fatigue and the endless stream of work calls. He rubbed his temples as if trying to rub away the day's tension and looked at her. "Shall we go down?" he asked, his voice soft, but with a familiar detachment. "Marge said dinner at 7. Maybe we can at least eat properly." Emma nodded, though her stomach clenched not with hunger, but with anticipation. She wanted this evening to be something special, a moment when they could finally look at each other without distractions, without phones, without the ghosts of their everyday lives. She pulled a light cardigan over her dress, smoothed back her hair, which had already been tousled by the wind, and followed Josh down the creaky stairs. The hotel lobby had changed with the evening. The fireplace burned brighter now, casting a warm glow across the wood paneling, and the air was filled with the aroma of fried fish and herbs from the dining room. But their steps turned away from the dining room and toward a small bar tucked into a corner of the ground floor. The door was ajar, and soft light poured in, mixed with the soft strains of jazz, a tune Emma recognized, but could not place the name of. Something about love lost in the rain. The bar was small, almost intimate, with dark wood paneling and a counter lined with bottles that glinted in the candlelight. A few tables covered with linen tablecloths were set up by the windows, where the rain was beginning to lash down, leaving long streams on the glass. There was a man behind the bar, Lucas, according to the name tag on his shirt. He was in his early 30s, with dark hair that was slightly tousled and eyes the color of a stormy sea that seemed to see more than he was saying. His movements were confident, almost theatrical, as he polished his glass, but there was an ease to them, as if he were not just a bartender here, but the keeper of some secret the bar was hiding. "Good evening," Lucas said, his voice low and slightly husky, making it both warm and foreboding. "What can I get you? Do we have some excellent local cider, or perhaps something stronger to warm you up before the storm?" Emma felt his gaze linger on her a little longer than politeness required. It wasn't intrusive, but there was a glimmer in his eyes, not just curiosity, but something deeper, almost insightful, as if he already knew more about her than she was willing to share. She looked away quickly, feeling the warmth in her cheeks, and took a seat at the bar next to Josh, who was already studying the cocktail menu printed on a tattered card. "Cider sounds good," Josh said, not looking up. "And maybe something to eat. Any snacks?" Lucas nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Of course. We have oysters, fresh from the bay this morning, and a little cheese plate. I recommend the oysters, they taste like the sea." He looked at Emma again, and this time she couldn't look away so quickly. His eyes seemed to ask something she didn't know the answer to. "Oysters will do," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice even. "And cider, please." Lucas nodded and turned back to the counter, his movements fluid, as if he were dancing to music only he could hear. Emma glanced at Josh, hoping he'd notice her gaze, but he was already back on his phone, his fingers typing quickly as he responded to yet another email. She suppressed a sigh, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her cardigan, and turned to the window, where the rain was now pouring down in sheets and the wind was howling like a wounded animal. "Looks like we're stuck here," she said, trying to make conversation. "The hurricane. Weird, huh? It's like Montauk itself decided to lock us in." Josh looked up, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Yeah, a little dramatic," he said with a small smile, but quickly went back to his phone. "Maybe it's for the best, though. Get away from it all for a couple of days." Emma wanted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Disconnect? She doubted he could disconnect for even an hour. Instead, she turned to Lucas, who was already setting 2 glasses of golden cider in front of them, the bubbles sparkling in the candlelight. He pushed a plate of oysters garnished with a sprig of dill toward them and smiled, looking back at Emma. "You're not from around here," he said, and it wasn't a question. "What brings you to Montauk? Are you running from something or looking for something?" Emma froze, her fingers tightening around the cold glass. His question was too precise, too close to a truth she barely dared admit even to herself. Josh seemed oblivious to the subtext, too busy tasting his oyster. "Just a change of scenery," he answered for both of them, shrugging. "Work, sometimes you need to breathe." Lucas nodded, but his gaze stayed on Emma, and she felt her heart beat a little faster. "I see," he said, his voice soft but with depth, as if he knew there was more to the exhale. "Montauk is good for that. Time seems to slow down here. Too much sometimes." Emma took a sip of her cider, the tart taste mixing with the salty aftertaste of the oyster, and she felt the tension in her chest ease a little. The bar was nearly empty, except for a couple of older patrons sitting in the corner, talking quietly, their voices drowned out by the rain and the music. Lucas had gone to serve them, but Emma could still feel his presence, like a soft electric current in the air. "He's right, she said, turning to Josh. "Time is different here. Can you feel it?" Josh looked at her, his eyes distant, but he nodded. "Yeah, I guess, though I think the storm makes everything a little theatrical." He smiled, and this time there was something genuine in it, something that reminded her of those evenings when they could talk for hours without noticing the time. She wanted to seize this moment, to hold on to it, But then his phone vibrated again, and he mumbled an apology before typing. Emma looked away, her gaze finding Lucas again, now polishing glasses, but his eyes caught hers briefly, and she felt her cheeks heat up again. It was ridiculous she was married. She was here to save her marriage, not to get lost in the bartender's mysterious gaze. And yet something about him, his quiet confidence, the attention she so desperately craved, made her heart beat unevenly. The rain outside grew heavier, turning into a roar, and the lights in the bar flickers briefly, making everyone freeze. Lucas looked up, his smile almost boyish. "Don't worry," he said to everyone in the room. "Our generator is strong. The storm just adds to the atmosphere." Emma laughed, unexpectedly, and Josh looked at her with mild surprise. "What's funny?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "It's just, he's right. It's like a movie. A storm, an old bar, us all locked in here. There's something romantic about it." Josh raised an eyebrow, but a smile tugged at his lips. "Romantic, you say? Well, maybe you're right." He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers, and for a moment she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in so long. But then his phone beeped again, and the moment vanished. Emma finished her cider, her thoughts swirling like the wind outside her window. She didn't know what this evening, this storm, this Montauk would bring. But deep down, she felt something was changing in her, in Josh, in the air around them. And Lucas, with his piercing eyes, seemed to know it better than anyone. Night fell upon Montauk like a black wing, and the hurricane that had been warned about on the radio hit the coast with a fury that seemed determined to wipe the town off the face of the earth. The wind howled outside the Walls Driftwood Inn, his voice low and menacing, like an ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. The windows shook in their frames, and the rain lashed against the glass with such ferocity that it sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of pebbles at the walls of the inn. Emma sat at the bar, her fingers fiddling nervously with the rim of her empty cider glass, her eyes darting between Josh, still typing on his phone, and the dark window, where the world dissolved into chaos in the water and wind. The line had been cut off for about an hour. First the Wi-Fi, then the cell phone network, and even the radio in the lobby was a crackle and a smattering of voices until Marge turned it off with a tired sigh. The roads out of Montauk were closed. An elderly couple sitting in the corner of the bar had told them when they returned from an abortive attempt to leave before the storm. Now there were only a few people left at the inn. Emma and Josh, the couple Mr. and Mrs. Clark, as they introduced themselves Marge, Lucas, and a cook whose name Emma had not yet learned. They were an odd group, trapped together in this wooden shelter, where every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind seemed part of some sinister symphony. Emma felt the air in the bar growing heavier, as if the walls were closing in around them, and the silence between the gusts of wind only made it feel more claustrophobic. She glanced at Josh, hoping he'd feel her gaze, but he was absorbed in his phone, though now that he had no service, he was simply scrolling through old messages, as if he hoped to find something in them that would give him back control. She wanted to say something, anything, to break through this wall between them, but the words she was looking for seemed as out of reach as the stars behind the clouds. "It looks like we're going to be here for a while," she said finally, her voice quieter than she'd intended, almost drowned out by the roar of the storm. No communication, no roads, like an old horror movie. Josh looked up, his eyebrows lifting slightly, and he managed a smile that seemed more habit than genuine. "Yeah, but without the axe-wielding maniac, I hope," he said, trying to be funny, but his voice was tense, like a string about to snap. He set his phone down on the counter, and Emma saw his fingers pause for a moment, as if he didn't know what to do without the device that had become an extension of his arm. Lucas, standing behind the bar, laughed, his voice low and warm, but with a slight rasp that made it both comforting and alarming. "There are no maniacs here," he said, pouring water into an unasked-for carafe. "But a storm, it could bring out something worse." His eyes, dark and deep as the ocean outside, found Emma again, and she felt her heart tighten at the sight of him, looking right through her. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a tremor in her voice. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer, but the silence in the bar, broken only by the howling wind, demanded some kind of sound. Lucas shrugged, his smile small, but with a hint of something unsaid. Storms like this, they're like mirrors. They show you what you're hiding. From yourself, from others. He turned to wipe down the counter, but his words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Emma felt her cheeks heat up and quickly looked away, focusing on Mrs. Clark, who was sitting in the corner, nervously fiddling with the hem of her shawl. Her husband, a thin man with graying temples, was speaking quietly to her, but his words were lost in the noise of the storm. Emma suddenly wondered if they, too, had come here to save something their love, their memories, their past. Or maybe they were just running from something, like she and Josh. "How about we play a game?" she suggested suddenly, her voice louder than she'd expected, and everyone in the bar turned to look at her. She felt the blood rush to her face, but she continued, trying to hide her awkwardness. "Well, since we're all stuck here, cards, maybe, or something." Mrs. Clark looked at her with a grateful smile, her eyes, faded with age, gleaming with faint interest. "Oh, that would be nice," she said, her voice thin as an autumn leaf. "Henry and I have a deck in our room. I can get it." "That's a great idea," Lucas said, setting a bowl of unordered nuts on the counter. "I've got an old poker set around here somewhere. Not exactly tarot cards, but they can tell a story too." He winked, and Emma felt that strange electric current that ran across her skin every time he looked at her. Josh seemed to finally notice her discomfort because he put his phone down and put his hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, but it lacked the closeness she craved. "Poker, huh?" he said, trying to back up her idea. "Don't tell me you're going to bluff her again like that time in Vegas." Emma smiled, thinly, a little sadly, remembering their honeymoon. They had spent half the night at a card table in a noisy, colorful casino, tired but happy, laughing and teasing each other, as if they were not husband and wife, but two conspirators on the run from the world. She remembered Josh, risking his last chips, deliberately making stupid bets to upset her, and then laughing as he pulled an ace out of his sleeve literally. He actually hit a card once. How she had slapped him on the shoulder, pretended to be angry, but couldn't help laughing. His eyes had shone warmly, sincerely. That night, they hadn't thought about the future, about bills, about time. Just them and this strange, heady feeling that anything was possible. This memory was one of her inner treasures, a small, bright fragment of past happiness that she carefully kept within herself. But now it seemed so distant, as if she were looking at it through thick glass, behind which everything remained alive but unattainable. "I'm not promising anything," she said finally, trying to make her voice sound light, almost playful. But something inside her was clenching, as if her heart, without knowing the words, was trying to grasp this fleeting moment. As if it understood before she did that such moments short, fragile, are on the brink of the end. She looked at Josh again, and suddenly she had a terrible urge to ask, "Do you remember? Do you remember anything about how we were then?" But she didn't, because she was afraid of the answer, or the lack of one. Mrs. Clark returned with a deck of cards, battered and yellowed, but still playable. Lucas brought an old poker set, and they all gathered at a round table by the window, where the rain pounded the glass, creating a rhythm that was both soothing and unsettling. Marge joined them, bringing a decanter of local wine that smelled of berries and the sea, and even the cook, a silent man named Tom, came out of the kitchen to watch. The game began slowly, with awkward banter and careful betting. Emma noticed how Mrs. Clark kept touching her husband's arm as if seeking his support, and he responded with a light squeeze that seemed more habit than feeling. Lucas, on the other hand, was in his element, his fingers shuffling the cards deftly, his eyes sparkling as he dealt them out, as if he knew what everyone held. He joked, told stories of storms past, of the time the sea washed up a whole case of old rum, and his words seemed to weave into the sound of the wind outside the window, creating an odd sense that the evening had been more than just a chance encounter. Emma tried to focus on the game, but her thoughts kept returning to Josh, to the way he sat next to her, but seemed so far away. She noticed little things, the way he frowned when he lost, the way his fingers tapped nervously on the table, the way he avoided her gaze when she tried to catch him. And yet, when he won a hand and smiled at her, she felt a glimmer of hope, like a ray of light breaking through the clouds. But then the lights in the bar flickered again, longer this time, and everyone froze, watching the chandelier swing as if struck by an invisible hand. The wind outside the window roared with renewed vigor, and somewhere in the depths of the inn there was a loud crash, as if something had broken. Marge frowned, but Lucas only laughed, his voice cutting through the silence. "Don't worry," he said. "It's just the old house complaining about the weather. It's been through worse." But Emma felt her heart beat faster. It wasn't just the storm. It was something more, as if the night itself was trying to tell her something they were all afraid to hear. She looked at Lucas, and his eyes, dark and unreadable, found hers again, and this time she couldn't look away. There was something in his gaze that made her feel both vulnerable and alive, as if he was seeing a part of her she had long forgotten. The game continued, but the atmosphere in the bar had changed. The storm outside and the silence inside wove together in a strange dance, where every sound, every look seemed part of some larger pattern. Emma felt the walls of the hotel closing in around her, but at the same time she felt a strange excitement, as if this storm, this night, this bar were the beginning of something that would change everything. The storm did not subside. Its roar penetrated the walls driftwood inn like an ancient choir mourning something long forgotten. In the bar, where Emma, Josh, and the rest of the patrons continued to play cards, the air had grown thick, saturated with the smell of wet wood and wine and tension no one dared name. Emma felt her eyelids growing heavy, her thoughts growing slow, as if they were stuck in molasses. Every sip of cider, every laugh Lucas gave her, every look he gave her seemed to pull her deeper into some strange, almost tangible numbness. She tried to shake herself, to focus on the cards, on Josh, on anything that would keep her grounded, but her mind seemed to be playing its own games with her. When the game was over, Mr. Clark had won the last hand with unexpected dexterity, drawing muted laughter from the table. Emma felt her body protesting every move. Her head was spinning slightly, as if she'd been on a carousel for too long, and there was a slight but persistent ache throbbing in her temples. She glanced at Josh, who was helping Marge collect the cards, his movements as mechanical as they always were when he tried to fill the space between them with action. Emma wanted to say something, but her voice seemed stuck somewhere in her throat, lost in the sound of the wind outside the window. "Shall we go to bed?" she finally managed, her words sounding hoarse, almost alien. Josh nodded, his face tired, but with a hint of relief in his eyes, as if he, too, was looking for an excuse to get away from this evening, this room, these people. They said their goodbyes to the others, Mrs. Clark bidding them good night, her voice shaking with exhaustion, and Lucas, standing behind the desk, simply nodded, but his gaze, as always, lingered on Emma. She felt her skin itch under his gaze, as if he had left an invisible mark on her. She turned away quickly, following Josh up the creaky stairs to their room, but even the footsteps echoing down the hallway couldn't drown out the feeling that something had changed in her, as if the storm outside had awakened something inside. The room was cold, despite the crackling heater in the corner. The windows shook in the wind, and Emma threw off her cardigan and crawled under the heavy blanket, hoping the warmth would bring her back to her senses. Josh undressed silently, his movements quick, almost businesslike, and when he lay down next to her, there was a strip of cold space between them that neither of them dared to cross. She listened to his breathing, even and distant, and tried to remember the last time they had fallen asleep, cuddled together, his warmth and her refuge. But her thoughts slipped away, dissolving into the roar of the storm, and soon she fell into a heavy, restless sleep. The dreams came almost immediately, vivid and chaotic, like shards of a broken mirror. She saw the ocean, not the one that crashed against the rocks outside their window, but another, endless, with water that glowed like liquid silver. She was standing on the shore, barefoot, the sand cold beneath her feet, and in the distance, at the water's edge, stood Lucas. His silhouette was clear despite the distance, and he was looking at her, his eyes glowing with the same strange light as the sea. He was saying something, his lips moving, but there were no words, only a low hum like the voice of a storm. Emma took a step toward him, her feet sinking into the sand, and with each step she felt her body grow lighter, as if she were dissolving into thin air. But then the scene changed, and she found herself at the bar, behind the counter, with Lucas handing her a glass, but instead of cider, there was a dark, thick liquid in it, like ink. "Drink this," he said, and his voice was so real she shuddered. "It will help you remember." She woke with a start, her heart pounding and her throat dry, as if she had been screaming in her sleep. The room was dark, the only light from the moon filtering through the clouds to fall on the floor in trembling patterns. Josh was asleep next to her, his breathing deep, but Emma felt alone, as if he were 1,000 miles away. She sat up, pressing her palms to her temples, trying to calm the dizziness that wouldn't go away. Her mind was hazy, as if someone had thrown a thin veil over it, and she couldn't separate the dream from the reality. Had she talked to Lucas? She remembered his voice, his words, but she couldn't remember when it had been at the bar, in the dream, or somewhere else. She stood, her bare feet touching the cold floor, and walked to the window. The storm was still raging, but there was something rhythmic to its roar now, almost hypnotic, as if it were trying to tell her a story. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath making little clouds on it, and tried to remember. Lucas, his eyes, his words. This will help you remember. But remember what? She felt her thoughts swirling like leaves in the wind, and every time she tried to grab one, it slipped away. Suddenly she remembered a moment in the bar, not the one when they were playing cards, but another, earlier, when Josh had gone to the counter to order more wine and Lucas had leaned toward her, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You look like you're looking for something you can't find," he'd said, and the words had seemed strange to her then, but now they rang in her head like an echo. Was this real? Or had this, too, been a dream? She shook her head, trying to clear the confusion, but instead felt her mind slip into a strange, fuzzy state where memories mingled with visions. She remembered once, back in college, when she'd had a similar sensation, a déjà vu that came in waves, making her feel like she'd lived this moment before. Back then, she'd chalked it up to fatigue, too much coffee, too many sleepless nights. But this was different, deeper, stronger, as if someone or something was trying to reach through the veil of her consciousness. She closed her eyes, and Lucas appeared before her again, but this time he was standing in their room by the window, his form translucent as a ghost. He held out his hand, and she felt her fingers reaching for him, even though she didn't move. Emma's eyes snapped open, her breath catching. The room was empty, the shadows of the branches swaying outside the window dancing on the walls. But the sense of his presence remained, like a faint scent she couldn't quite place, but could smell. She walked back to the bed, her legs shaking, and lay down, trying not to wake Josh. But when she closed her eyes, the dreams came back, more vivid, more insistent. She saw herself walking down the hallway of the inn, but the walls were different, old and moldy, and the air was heavy, like a storm was coming. Lucas was there, at the end of the hall, beckoning her, his smile both warm and terrifying. When she woke again, it was dawn. The storm was still roaring, but its fury seemed to have died down a bit, replaced by a monotonous, exhausting hum. Emma lay staring at the ceiling, her heart still pounding, her mind spinning with fragments of dreams that seemed too real to be imagination. She looked at Josh, still asleep, his face relaxed, almost boyish, and for a moment she felt a surge of tenderness. But then she remembered Lucas, his voice, his eyes, and her chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and a strange, almost magnetic attraction. She stood up, threw on a cardigan, and walked quietly out of the room, her steps almost silent on the old floorboards. The hallway was empty, but there was something in the air that made her skin crawl. She walked down to the hall, where the lights were dim and the fireplace barely glowed. The bar was closed, but she swore she heard a whisper coming from behind the door, low and rhythmic, like Lucas's voice. She froze, her hand hovering on the railing, and in that moment she realized that something about this place, this storm, this man with whom she had barely exchanged a few words, was beginning to change her, as if dragging out a part of her soul that she had long since buried. Emma returned to her room, her heart pounding and her thoughts tangled like the threads of an old tapestry. She lay down next to Josh, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she lay listening to the storm and trying to figure out what was happening to her mind and why Lucas, this stranger with eyes the color of the sea, seemed to know more about her than she did. Morning in Driftwood in-game reluctantly, as if the storm still raging outside refused to give way to the light. The sky remained leaden gray, and the rain, though lighter, continued to tap on the roof, like the fingers of an invisible pianist playing an endless, unsettling melody. Emma woke up feeling as if she had not slept at all, her body heavy, her mind still tangled in fragments of dreams that seemed more like memories than fantasies. She lay staring at the cracks in the ceiling of their room, trying to pull herself together, but her thoughts slipped through her fingers like sand. Josh was still asleep, his breathing deep, but his face, even in sleep, seemed distant, as if he had already left this room, this town, her. She stood quietly, trying not to break the floorboards, and went to the window. The ocean looked like a living thing, its waves rising and falling like the breath of a giant, and the wind carried with it the scent of salt and something else, something ancient, almost mystical. Emma felt her heart beating unevenly, as if it were trying to keep up with the rhythm of the storm. She couldn't shake the feeling that this hurricane was more than just the weather, something that was getting into her bones, her thoughts, her marriage. Last night at the bar had left a mark on her that she couldn't erase. Lucas, his voice, his gaze, his words was like a melody she couldn't stop humming, even though she was afraid of it. She knew it was wrong, that she was here to save her love for Josh, but every time she tried to focus on her husband, her thoughts would wander back to the bartender, to his calm confidence, to the way he looked at her as if he saw a part of her she'd long forgotten. It scared her, but the fear was mixed with something else, an attraction she didn't want to acknowledge, but which grew like a shadow in the corner of the room. Emma dressed, choosing a simple linen blouse and jeans, and went downstairs, leaving Josh to sleep. The hotel lobby was empty, only the faint smell of coffee and burning wood hung in the air. Marge stood behind the front desk, her face tired but friendly, and she nodded to Emma, gesturing toward the small dining room where a modest breakfast was being served. Emma took a cup of coffee and sat by the window, her gaze wandering to the deserted beach beyond the glass, where the waves had left foamy scars in their wake. She didn't notice Lucas enter the dining room until he stopped next to her table, holding a pitcher of orange juice. His shirt was slightly unbuttoned, and his dark hair was still tousled, as if he'd just returned from a walk in the wind. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft, but with the same huskiness that made her skin crawl. "You look like you haven't slept." Emma winced, her fingers tightening around the hot cup. "The storm," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "It's keeping me awake." Lucas nodded, his eyes lingering on her, and she felt her heart speed up again. "Storms are like that here," he said, setting the pitcher on the table and sitting down across from her, though she hadn't invited him. "They wake up with everything that's sleeping, and not just the ones outside." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, and Emma felt the air between them thicken, as if charged with electricity. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. His eyes, deep and dark as the ocean outside the window, held her like a magnet. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended, and she immediately regretted the question because she knew he would say something that would throw her off balance again. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, and for a moment she felt his words touch her, like a gentle brush. "You came here to find something, but maybe you're afraid of what you'll find." Emma swallowed, her fingers shaking, and she set her cup down on the table to keep from spilling the coffee. "I'm here with my husband," she said, as if that would be a shield, but her voice was unsure, and she knew Lucas had noticed. "Of course," he said, and his smile was soft, but there was something about it that made her feel vulnerable. "But that doesn't change how you feel." He stood up, his movements fluid, almost cat-like, and touched her shoulder lightly as he passed her to pick up the tray of buns. It was a fleeting touch, barely noticeable, but it burned her like a spark. Emma watched him go, her breath catching in her throat as she felt her cheeks heat up. She was married. She loved Josh. Or at least she loved the Josh she'd known before, the one who'd looked at her like she was the center of his world. But this Josh who slept upstairs, who checked his phone even in his sleep, felt like a stranger to her, like a shadow of the man she'd once chosen. And Lucas was here, alive, real, and his presence filled her with both fear and a strange, almost painful attraction. When Josh finally came down to the dining room, his hair was tousled and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. He sat down across from her, picked up a bun, and began to break it into pieces without looking at her. "You're up early," he said, his voice even but lacking warmth. "Didn't sleep well." "Yes," she answered, trying to smile. "The storm, it's loud." Josh nodded, but his gaze had already slid to the phone he'd pulled out of his pocket despite the lack of signal. Emma felt her chest tighten, as if someone had tied an invisible rope around her ribs. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him look at her, but instead she just clutched the cup tighter and turned to the window. The day dragged on slowly. The storm did not allow anyone to leave the hotel, and Emma felt the walls of the Wallsdriftwood in growing tighter. She tried to occupy herself by reading a book she'd brought with her, but Rilke's words, usually so comforting, now seemed hollow. Josh spent the morning at his laptop, trying to connect to non-existent Wi-Fi, his fingers tapping the keys with growing irritation. They barely spoke, and whenever Emma tried to start a conversation, he responded curtly, his mind somewhere else, in the office, in deals, in a world that seemed more important to him than she was. Towards midday, Lucas appeared again, this time with a basket of logs for the fire in the hall. Emma was sitting in a chair by the fire, her book open in her lap, but she was not reading. She watched him arrange the logs, his movements precise, almost meditative. He caught her eye and smiled, and this time she did not look away. "Is it cold?" he asked, his voice light but with the same depth as before. "A little," she replied, though her shiver had nothing to do with her temperature. She felt something inside her reaching out to him, as if he were a beacon in this storm, and she couldn't resist his light. "You know," he said, squatting by the fireplace and looking up at her, "on days like these, it's best to just let go. Not thinking, not try to control, just be." Emma laughed, but her laugh was nervous, almost brittle. "Easy to say," she said. "Letting go, I don't even know how to do that." He looked at her, his eyes serious but with a sparkle in them, as if he knew the answer but wasn't going to give it. "You'll learn," he said, and his voice was so soft she felt her walls begin to crumble. He stood, his hand lingering on the back of her chair for a moment, another touch she couldn't ignore. When he was gone, Emma sat there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew she had to stop it, that this attraction, this strange chemistry between her and Lucas, was dangerous, but she couldn't leave. She didn't want to. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive, like someone had finally seen her, not as a wife, not as Josh's shadow, but as a woman full of desires and fears she barely understood. By evening, the storm had abated somewhat, but the roads were still closed and the hotel remained their prison. Josh suggested another game of cards, but Emma declined, citing a headache. She returned to her room, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes, but instead of sleeping, her mind was filled with images of Lucas again, his smile, his voice, his touch. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, and part of her wanted to step forward into the unknown, while another part screamed at her to back away before it was too late. But deep down she knew it was too late. Something had changed in her, and the storm, Lucas, that strange, hypnotic Montauk were just the beginning. She was afraid, but the fear was sweet as poison, and she couldn't stop drinking. Wind outside the windows driftwood roared with renewed vigor, as if the storm had decided to return to remind everyone trapped in this wooden shelter that it still ruled Montauk. The rain pounded the roof, its rhythm uneven, almost furious, like someone was pounding on the doors, demanding to be let in. Emma sat in the hall, her fingers clutching the book she hadn't been able to read for an hour, the words on the page blurring like ink under water. Her thoughts were elsewhere, in Lucas's dark eyes, in his deep voice, in the way his casual touch left a feeling on her skin she couldn't erase or understand. Josh was upstairs in their room, lost in his writing, trying to squeeze some work out of this forced confinement, and his absence was both a relief and a pain. Emma felt caught between who she was and who she was becoming in this strange, windswept place. Her mind was a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces of which didn't fit together. Dreams that felt more real than reality, Lucas's eyes that pierced her, and Josh who seemed further away with each passing day, like a ship sailing off into the horizon. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the warmth of the fireplace, but her body, her skin, her heart, everything vibrates like a taut string about to snap. The bar door creaked and Lucas appeared in the hall, his shirt slightly damp from the rain and his hair plastered to his forehead, as if he'd just returned from a quick foray outside. He was carrying a case of bottles, his muscles tense under the fabric, and Emma found herself looking at him longer than she should have. He noticed her looking and smiled, not the polite smile he gave everyone, but something more personal, almost intimate, as if they were sharing a secret she didn't yet know. "Can't sleep?" he asked, setting the box down and wiping his hands on his jeans. His voice was low, with a slight rasp that made her feel like he was speaking just for her. "The storm," she replied, her voice weak, almost a whisper. "It's interfering." Lucas nodded, his eyes never leaving her face, and she felt her cheeks begin to heat up. "Storms are like that around here," he said, his tone light, but with a depth to it, as if he were talking about something bigger than the weather. "They wake up with everything that's sleeping. Want to help me? I need to unpack a few boxes in the back while Marge is busy." Emma froze, her fingers gripping the book so tightly the edges of the pages crumpled. It was an innocent question, but there was something in his voice, in his eyes, that made it dangerous. She knew she should say no, go back to the room, to Josh, to the safety of their marriage, but her body, her mind, her desires, all of it pulled her toward him like a magnet. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking, and she stood, feeling her legs buckle, as if she were walking on thin ice. Lucas led her through the bar, past the counter that still smelled of cider and the sea, to a narrow door in the corner that led into the back room. The room was cramped, filled with boxes and old wooden shelves that smelled of dust and salt. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows on the walls, and the sound of the storm was muted here, but still there like a distant pulse. Lucas closed the door behind them, and the sound of the latch was louder than she expected, as if he had cut them off from the rest of the world. "Here," he said, pointing to the box of bottles. "We should check that they're all intact. The last storm broke a couple of boxes, and Marge's still grumbling." He smiled, but his eyes were serious, almost hypnotic, and Emma felt her breathing become uneven. She nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her hands shook as she opened the box. Lucas stood close, too close, his shoulder almost touching hers, and she could feel the heat of his body, his scent a mix of salt and wood smoke and something else she couldn't place, but which made her heart beat faster. They worked in silence, removing bottles, checking labels, but the silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words. "You're not like the people who usually come here," he said suddenly, his voice soft, but with a sense of power, as if he knew his words would find a target. "You're different. There's something in you that wants to get out." Emma froze, her fingers tightening around the cold glass of the bottle. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible, but she couldn't look away from his eyes, which seemed to see right through her. He stepped closer, until there was almost no space between them. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, and she felt his breath on her cheek. "I can see it in your eyes. You want something more, something real." His hand moved slowly up, and he touched her wrist, his fingers warm, but the touch burned like fire. Emma shook, her mind screaming at her to back away, but her body wouldn't listen. She could feel her skin coming alive beneath his fingers, her blood pulsing as if she were truly alive for the first time in years. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice full of confusion, but she didn't pull away. I'm married." "I know," he said, and his voice was so soft, so understanding, it almost broke her heart. But it doesn't change how you feel. I see the way you look at me, Emma. You want me. And damn, you're so beautiful when you try to hide it. Her breath hitched, her cheeks flushed, and she felt her knees buckle. His words were like poison, sweet and deadly, and she couldn't resist. He stepped closer, his hand sliding higher to her forearm, and she felt her body respond despite her efforts to maintain control. You shouldn't say that, she whispered, but her voice was weak, almost pleading. Why? He asked, his lips so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. Because it's true, because you know I'm right, your skin, your eyes, your chest. Everything about you screams alive, Emma. You've just forgotten what it's like to want. His fingers slid down her arm, feather light, but they left a mark she could feel with every cell in her body. She wanted to push him away, wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor and her mind was clouded, as if the storm outside had entered her head. She looked into his eyes, and there was something in them that both frightened and drew her in, as if he knew her better than she did. Lucas, she whispered again, but this time her voice was not protest, but something else, something she was afraid to name. He leaned closer, his face so close she could smell the faint scent of coffee and something else, familiar, almost intimate. His lips were inches from hers, and she felt her whole body respond, as if not her mind, but her skin itself had made a decision. She leaned in, instinctively, forgetting everything. The hotel, Josh, the conversation, the fear. Time seemed to stand still. But suddenly the light bulb above them flickered, screeching like a wounded bird, and somewhere deep in the building something cracked loudly. The sound was sharp, alien, as if reality itself had intervened. They both jumped, as if they had woken up. Lucas immediately retreated, his hand, which had been almost touching her thigh a second ago, dropped. All the magic, all the current between them, flew apart, like a taut thread that suddenly snapped. Emma stood there, stunned. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling heavily, as if she had been running for a long time. Chaos raged inside her guilt, molten desire, anxiety, terror, all mixed together in one uncontrollable torrent. Come on, he said, a little quieter than usual. His voice was even, but there was a tension in it, a slight tremor, as if he himself were barely keeping his balance. We need to finish these boxes. She nodded, unable to speak, afraid that her voice would betray her, would reveal everything she had tried so hard to suppress. They went back to work, but the atmosphere had changed. The utility room no longer seemed like a normal place. It was now echoing, almost sacred, like a temple after a sin. Every step, every movement echoed inside her. Emma avoided his gaze, hid her face, but every time their fingers accidentally touched, heat ran across her skin like a flash, brief and painful. They didn't speak. There was no need. Everything had already been said in silence. When the last box was put away, Emma turned sharply and almost ran out of the back room, as if running from something she couldn't afford. Her heart was pounding in her ears, her thoughts were tangled like threads in a knot, and all she wanted was to be somewhere for a moment where she knew who she was again. But that feeling was still pulsing in her chest, uncomfortable, sharp, dangerous. And with it fear. Maybe in this very moment she had actually crossed an invisible line. When she returned to her room, she found Josh asleep, his laptop open, a blank document glowing on the screen. She lay down next to him, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, images of Lucas filled her mind, his touch, his words, his gaze. She tried to remember what had happened in the back room, but the memories were as fuzzy as smoke. Were his words real? Was his touch real? Or was this another dream, another vision the storm had pulled from the depths of her mind? She lay there listening to the roar of the wind, feeling her heart torn between guilt and desire. Lucas was like a wave that was pulling her under, and she didn't know if she wanted to fight it or let herself drown. But she knew one thing for sure. Something had changed in her, and the change was irreversible, like a storm that wouldn't stop. World seemed dim, as if morning itself was afraid to break through the curtain of the storm that still held Montauk in its grip. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the sheets, her gaze glued to the window where the gray clouds merged with the sea in one endless, shifting mass. Her body felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, someone who hovered on the edge between wakefulness and sleep, between what had been and what might be. The night had left a mark on her, deep and unsettling, like a scar she couldn't see but felt in every fiber of her being. Memories of the utility room, of Lucas's touch, of his words that burned like fire, jumbled in her head, and she couldn't tell for sure how much was real and how much was just another dream the storm had woven into her mind. Josh had already gone downstairs, muttering something about coffee and trying to get a signal, even though they both knew there wouldn't be any service until the hurricane passed the town. His absence gave her space, but it also heightened her confusion, as if the silence in the room were a mirror reflecting her inner chaos. Emma stood, her movements slow, almost mechanical, and walked to the mirror above the dresser. Her reflection looked unfamiliar, dark circles under her eyes, hair mussed from restless sleep, and a gaze full of questions she didn't know the answers to. Who was she? A wife trying to save her marriage? A woman drawn to a stranger with eyes the color of a stormy sea? Or something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on? She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, and decided to go down to the hall, hoping that the movement, the smell of coffee, and the sound of other people's voices would bring her back to reality. But reality seemed to be growing thinner, like sand carried away by the tide. The hall was silent, except for Marge, busy at the counter, sorting through some papers, and Mr. and Mrs. Clark, sitting by the fire, their voices hushed, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Emma walked past them, her footsteps echoing on the old floorboards, and headed toward the small library in the corner of the hall, a narrow room she had noticed yesterday, but had not had time to explore. The library was tiny, little more than a closet, piled high with dusty books and old magazines. The shelves sagged under the weight of the volumes, and the air smelled of mildew and forgotten stories. Emma ran her finger along the spines, her gaze skimming over the faded titles, until she came across something that made her freeze. It wasn't a book, but a tattered journal, tucked between two volumes of sea stories. Its cover was darkened leather, embossed with the initials L, and it looked so old it felt like it might fall apart in her hands. She pulled it out carefully, her fingers shaking, as if she knew this journal held something that would change everything. Emma sat down on a dusty sofa in the corner of the library, her heart beating faster than she expected. She opened the diary, and the pages, yellowed with age, rustled under her fingers. The handwriting was small but neat, with curls that spoke of a hand used to writing with feeling. The first entry was dated August 1963, and the name written at the top made Emma wince. Elizabeth Lawrence. L, she began to read, her breathing becoming more ragged with each word. August 15th. Montauk greeted me with a storm, like it knew I came here to escape. I thought the sea would calm me, but it only stirs something inside, something I'm afraid of. He's here, in this inn. His name is William, and his eyes. They're like the sea before a storm. He looks at me, and I feel my heart breaking. I'm married, I love Henry, but William. He sees me, really sees me, and I can't stop thinking about him, even when I close my eyes. Emma froze, her fingers tightening around the edges of the journal. Elizabeth's words were like a mirror, reflecting back her own thoughts, her own fear, her own desire. She turned the page, her eyes roving hungrily over the lines, each new entry a blow, an echo of her own life. August 17th. I can't sleep. The dreams come every night, so vivid that I don't know where reality ends. Yesterday, I saw him in a dream, William. He stood by the sea and called me, but his voice was like the wind, and I couldn't understand the words. And today, I talked to him in a bar, or I think I did. He said that I was hiding myself, that I was afraid to be alive. I don't remember when it was day, night, or was it a dream. My memory breaks like glass, and I can't put the pieces back together. Emma felt her throat tighten. She closed the journal, but Elizabeth's words continued to ring in her head like a bell. It was too familiar, too close. She stood, her legs shaking, and tucked the journal into the pocket of her cardigan, not knowing why, but feeling she couldn't leave it there. Her mind was a maze where dreams and reality were tangled, and she couldn't find her way out. Was she herself? Or was she becoming someone else, Elizabeth, the woman from the past whose story seemed to be repeating itself on her own? She walked back into the hall, her steps unsteady, as if she were afraid the floor would cave in beneath her. Lucas was there, by the fireplace, stacking logs, and his presence hit her like a wave. He looked up, his eyes finding hers, and she felt her skin come alive, as if he had touched her, even though he was meters away. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost caring, but with the same hypnotic power that had drawn her to him. "Yes," she lied, her voice hoarse, and she turned away, afraid he'd see the truth in her eyes. She walked into the dining room where Josh sat with a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the window, but seeing nothing but his own thoughts. Emma sat across from him, her fingers clutching the journal in her pocket, and she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "You're acting weird today," Josh said, finally looking at her. His voice was even, but there was a hint of irritation in it, as if her condition was another problem he had to solve. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," she said, her voice weak, and she knew he wouldn't believe it. "Just the storm. It's getting on my nerves." Josh nodded, but his gaze had already slid back to the phone he held in his hand, though the screen was dark. Emma felt her chest tighten, as if the air had been squeezed out of her. She wanted to tell him about the journal, about the dreams, about her mind disintegrating, but she knew he wouldn't understand. He was too far away in his world of deals and deadlines, and she couldn't reach him. By lunchtime, the storm had died down a bit, but the sky was still heavy and the sea was still boiling like a cauldron. Emma decided to take a walk around the hotel, hoping that the movement would help her collect her thoughts. She wandered the corridors, her fingers sliding over the wood paneling, her eyes catching on the old photographs on the wall's lighthouses, fishing boats, the faces of people long gone. She stopped at one of a young woman with long hair standing by the sea, her eyes filled with the same longing that Emma felt in herself. On the back of the photograph was written, "Elizabeth, Summer 1963. Emma shuddered, her fingers tightening around the journal in her pocket. This couldn't be a coincidence. She walked back into the room, closed the door, and opened the journal again, her eyes greedily taking in the words. August 20th. I'm losing myself. I see him everywhere in my dreams, in the shadows, in the reflection of the water. Today he touched my hand, and I felt my body catch fire, like I was a match, and he was a flame. I know this is wrong, but I can't stop. I want him, I want to feel alive, I want to forget who I am. But I'm afraid it's not me, it's Montauk, it's the storm. Something in this place knows me better than I know myself." Emma closed the journal, her heart pounding and her thoughts swirling like leaves in the wind. She felt her reality cracking, like she was glass, ready to shatter. Was she Emma, or was she becoming Elizabeth? Were her dreams just dreams, or were they memories that weren't hers? And Lucas, was he just a bartender, or was he something more, something that connected her to this woman from the past? She lay down on the bed, her eyes closed, and the dreams came again, bright as lightning. She saw Elizabeth standing by the sea, her dress fluttering in the wind, and a man standing next to her, his face in shadow but his eyes familiar. Emma woke up screaming, her body covered in sweat, and the diary lying on the floor, open to the last page. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and read the last entry. August 25th. I can't resist anymore. He calls me, and I go. I don't know what comes next, but I know this is the end, or the beginning. Montauk took me, and I don't want to go back. Emma closed the journal, her breathing ragged and her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid it would wake Josh. She knew she should stop, that she should throw this journal away, leave Lucas, go back to her life. But she couldn't. Something about this place, this storm, this man was pulling at her like a tide, and she didn't know if she wanted to fight it or let herself drown. Emma was sitting in the hall, her fingers clutching Elizabeth's tattered journal, which she still couldn't bring herself to put away. The storm outside had abated a little, but the sky was heavy and the sea still pounded the rocks with a dull fury. She felt torn between her duty to Josh, her increasingly distant husband, and this strange, almost animalistic attraction to Lucas that she could neither explain nor suppress. Her mind was a labyrinth, where every turn led to a new question, and the answers eluded her like shadows. Josh spent the morning in his room, trying to call the office, though the connection was still down. His irritation was as palpable as static electricity, and Emma tried to keep her distance from him, afraid that any word or look from her would betray her confusion. She sat by the fireplace, pretending to read, but her eyes kept wandering to the bar door, where Lucas was fiddling with bottles, his movements as smooth and sure as ever. She didn't notice him approaching until he stopped next to her, his shadow falling across her book. "You look lost," he said, his voice low, with that huskiness that made her heart beat faster. "Do you want to talk?" Emma looked at him, her fingers tightening around the journal. "Not here," she said quietly, her voice shaking. She knew it was dangerous, that every conversation with him was pulling her deeper into this vortex, but she couldn't stop. "Somewhere far away." Lucas nodded, his eyes glittering as if he'd been expecting it. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward a narrow hallway behind the bar that led to a small room where supplies were kept. Emma stood, her legs weak, and followed him, her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid she'd be heard. The room was cramped, smelling of dust and old wood, with shelves piled high with boxes and bottles. Lucas closed the door, and the sound of the latch was like a gunshot in the silence. They stood face to face, and the air between them was charged, like before a storm. Emma felt her skin burn under his gaze, her body reaching out to him despite her best efforts to resist. "I can't stop thinking about you," Lucas said, his voice rough, almost hoarse with effort. "You're driving me crazy, Emma. I want you. I want you now." Her breath hitched, her cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "Lucas," she began, but her voice broke, and she felt her body betray her, leaning into him. "I want you too," she whispered, and the words came out of her as if someone else was speaking for her. "But I shouldn't." "Screw the should," he said, stepping closer, his hand brushing her waist, the contact like an electric shock. "I see the way you look at me. You want this. I want to throw you on the bed, rip that blouse off, and feel you underneath me." Emma shook, her mind screaming at her to stop, but her body responded to his every word, his every movement. She felt the warmth of his hand, his breath on her neck, and it was too much, too strong, too real. You don't understand," she whispered, but her hands were already reaching for him, touching his chest, feeling the hardness of his muscles under his shirt. "I'm married, Lucas. I know," he said, his lips so close she could feel their warmth. "But you're here with me, and I want you, Emma. I want to see you lose control. I want you to be mine." His hand slid higher, to her neck, and he pulled her closer, their lips inches apart. Emma felt her mind dissolving, her body giving in. She wanted him. She wanted to lose herself in this moment, forget about Josh, about the marriage, about the journal burning in her pocket. But before she could say anything, the door creaked, and the sound was like lightning. Josh stood in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes ablaze with a mixture of anger and pain. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low, almost a growl, and Emma felt her heart sink. "Josh," she began, her voice shaking, but he didn't let her finish. "I heard everything, Emma," he said, his fists clenching. "I want you. I want to push you onto the bed. Are you serious?" He turned to Lucas, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just touch my wife, you bastard?" Lucas raised his hands, his face calm, but his eyes gleaming with challenge. "Calm down, buddy," he said. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Josh stepped forward, his voice growing louder. "I heard every word, asshole. You think I'm blind? You think I didn't see the way you looked at her?" Emma felt her legs buckle. "Josh, please," she said, her voice weak, almost pleading. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me," he snapped, turning to face her. His face was twisted in pain, and Emma felt her heart break. I saw the way you looked at him, Emma. I'm not an idiot. Do you think I don't notice how you're pulling away? How do you look at him like he means something? She didn't know what to say because part of her knew he was right. She wanted Lucas, wanted what he offered, not just sex, but the feeling of being alive, of being wanted. But another part of her loved Josh, or at least loved the Josh who had once been her world. That's enough, Josh said, his voice cold as steel. I'm leaving. Right now. He turned toward the door, but Lucas stepped forward. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice calm but firm. The roads are closed. The storm won't let up. Josh turned, his face red with anger. Don't give me that storm spiel, he growled. I'm not staying here to watch you grope my wife. Josh, stop. Emma grabbed his hand, her fingers shaking. Please, let's talk. This is all wrong. I didn't mean to. You didn't want to? He pulled his hand away, his eyes full of pain. You stood there, letting him tell you that he wanted to get you into bed, and you talked back. His voice broke, and he turned away, his shoulders shaking. I thought we came here to fix things. And you just... Emma felt tears sting her eyes. I don't know what's wrong with me, she whispered. I'm confused, Josh. I didn't mean for this to happen. Lucas was silent, his eyes moving between Emma and Josh, but he did not intervene. Emma felt his presence like a shadow, and it only increased her confusion. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but she stood frozen as a statue between two men who seemed to be tearing her apart. I can't stay here, Josh said, his voice quieter but determined. I'll find a way to leave, with or without you, Emma. Josh, please, she said, her voice breaking. The roads are closed. You can't. I'll find a way, he snapped, and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Emma remained standing, her body shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Lucas, and his eyes, dark and impenetrable, were full of something she couldn't place: regret, desire, or maybe something else. Go away, she said, her voice weak but firm. Please, just go. Lucas nodded, his face serious, and he walked out, leaving her alone in the cramped room that still smelled of his presence. Emma sank to the floor, her hands clasped around her knees, and she began to cry, her tears mixing with the noise of the storm. She felt her marriage crumbling, her mind breaking, and how Lucas, this stranger who had awakened something long forgotten in her, was both her salvation and her undoing. She pulled the journal out of her pocket, her fingers shaking as she opened it. Elizabeth's words were like a knife piercing her heart. I can't resist anymore. He calls me, and I go. Emma closed the journal and clutched it to her chest, her thoughts racing as the storm outside roared as if laughing at her. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go on like this, torn between two realities, two men, two versions of herself. Emma stood in the hall, her fingers still clutching Elizabeth's journal, which had become her talisman, her curse. The storm outside the windows had not abated, but its fury now seemed muted, as if it was tired of fighting itself. Inside her, however, the storm was only gathering strength. The scene in the utility room with Lucas, the words he had whispered, his touch, and then Josh's anger, his threat to leave, all of it had jumbled in her head like paint on a palette, creating a chaos she could not untangle. Josh had gone into the room, slamming the door, and his absence was like a knife stabbed into her chest. She knew she should go after him, beg, explain, but her legs would not move, and her heart was pulling her in the other direction toward Lucas. She found him at the bar, wiping down the counter, his movements slow, almost lazy, but with the same magnetic energy that had drawn her to him from the start. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, making them darker, deeper. He looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips, as if he had known she would come. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low, with that huskiness that made her skin burn. Emma shook her head, her voice caught in her throat. She felt her body shaking, her mind struggling with the desire that was growing with each passing moment. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered, her eyes meeting his, and she felt her walls crumble. Lucas stepped toward her, his hand brushing her wrist, and it was like a spark that set her on fire. "You know," he said, his voice firm but soft as velvet. "You want this, Emma. Stop fighting." He pulled her closer, and she didn't resist, her body leaning forward as if it knew what it wanted, even if her mind was screaming for something else. They found themselves in his room, small, almost austere, with a narrow bed and a window where the storm was still howling. The door closed behind them, and the world narrowed to this space, to their breath, to the warmth of his hands sliding down her waist, removing her blouse with such ease as if he had done it 1,000 times. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, his lips brushing her neck, and she shivered, her fingers clutching at his shirt. "I want you, Emma. I want to feel you. I want you to be mine." She didn't answer, but her body spoke for her. She pulled him toward her, her lips finding his, and the kiss was an explosion, hot, hungry, desperate, and needy. His hands slid over her skin, removing her clothes, and she felt her body respond to his every touch, as if it had been made for this moment. They fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, and Emma lost herself in the rhythm of their movements, in his breathing, in his whispers. "I want you," he repeated, his voice hoarse, almost a growl, and she answered him, her words a mixture of moans and confessions. "I want you too, Lucas. I want everything." The night was like a fever, like a dream she didn't want to wake from. His hands were everywhere, his lips were exploring her body, and she gave herself to him, forgetting about Josh, about the marriage, about the diary, about everything that held her captive. It wasn't just sex, it was liberation, as if she had finally thrown off the chains that had bound her for years. She felt him inside her, his rhythm, his heat, and each of his thrusts was a blow that destroyed her old life and built something new, unknown. When it was over, they lay in the dark, their breathing the only sound other than the storm outside. Emma felt his arm around her waist, his warmth, and for a moment she thought she could stay here forever, in this moment where there was nothing but the two of them. But then reality began to creep back in, like a cold wind through the cracks in the window. She turned to him, her eyes searching the darkness. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice full of confusion. Lucas looked at her, his eyes dark, but with a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, regret or triumph. "You're finally awake, Emma," he said, his voice soft but strong. "You were in a dream, trapped in a life that was suffocating you, and now you're alive." She felt her heart squeeze. "But, Josh," she said, her voice shaking, I don't know how I can look him in the eye." Lucas sat up, his hand still on her waist, but his touch seemed colder now. "Forget him," he said, his voice firmer. "Forget everything. You can start over, Emma. Here, with me. This place, it sets people free. I've seen it before. Women like you, coming here, lost, and finding themselves." Her eyes widened, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice weak but filled with concern. "Other women?" Lucas smiled, but his smile was different than before. There was something predatory in it, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "Montauk is a special place," he said. "The storms, the sea, this inn, they bring out what people hide. I've helped others find themselves. I can help you." Emma felt her stomach clench. She sat up, pulling the sheets up over her, her body still shaking from their closeness. But it was a different kind of shaking now, fear mixed with self-loathing. Have you done this before?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "With others?" Lucas shrugged, his eyes unreadable. "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that you're here with me. You can leave everything behind, Josh, your old life. I can show you how." Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She stood, her legs weak, and began gathering her clothes, her movements jerky, almost panicked. I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "This was a mistake. I love Josh." Lucas looked at her, his face calm, but there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "You can run, Emma," he said, "but you can't run from yourself. Not here, not in Montauk." She didn't answer, her hands shaking as she pulled on her blouse and jeans. She ran out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, the storm outside seeming to laugh at her. She went back to her room where Josh was asleep, his face relaxed, but she knew he would see the truth in her eyes in the morning. She lay down on the bed, her body still warm from Lucas, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She was shocked at herself, at how easily she had given in, how easily she had betrayed everything she had. Morning came with gray light that barely broke through the clouds. Emma sat by the window, her eyes red from crying, Elizabeth's journal in her lap. She opened it, her fingers shaking, and read the last entry. I left with him. I don't know what will happen next, but I know I can't go back. Emma closed the journal, her heart pounding. She knew she had reached the point of no return, but she didn't know where to go from here. Lucas was offering her a new life, but his words about other women rang in her head like a warning. And Josh, she still loved him, or at least she loved the version of him that existed in her memories. She looked at Josh's sleeping form, and her chest tightened with guilt. She knew she had to tell him, but the thought was like a knife. The storm was still roaring outside, and Emma felt like it wouldn't let her go, just like it hadn't let Elizabeth go. She was trapped not just in Montauk, but in herself, and she was past the point of no return. Emma woke up feeling like her body was a stranger, her mind a broken mirror reflecting the shards of what she had done. The light filtering through the cracks in the curtains was cold, gray, like a storm still raging outside, driftwood in, sucked all the color out of the world. She lay on the bed, her eyes burning with tears, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Josh slept next to her, his breathing even, but even in his sleep he seemed distant, like someone she had already lost. The memory of the night with Lucas burned her like poison, and his words, "You're finally awake," rang in her head like a mockery. She felt dirty, a traitor, but the worst thing was that she couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas knew something about her that she didn't understand, and that this knowledge was not just a temptation, but something sinister. She stood, her movements jerky, almost panicked. Elizabeth's journal lay on the nightstand, its tattered cover alive, as if it were watching her. She grabbed it, her fingers shaking, and shoved it into the pocket of her jeans. She needed to get away from Lucas, from this place, from herself. Josh was right. They had to leave, despite the storm, despite the closed roads. She couldn't stay in this hotel any longer, where every corner, every sound, every look from Lucas pulled her deeper into the abyss. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake Josh, and walked out into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the inn were listening to her, watching her. The hall was empty, the fireplace was barely burning, and Marge was not behind the bar. Emma paused, her gaze sliding toward the door of the bar, where she knew she would find Lucas. Part of her still reached for him, for his voice, for his touch, but another part of her, the part that still clung to her sanity, was screaming that he couldn't be trusted. His words about other women, his hints that he was helping them, were red flags she'd ignored for too long. She turned toward the exit, deciding to check if the roads were still closed. But when she pulled on the heavy oak door, it didn't budge. Emma frowned, tugging harder, but the door was rooted to the frame. She glanced around, her heart beating faster, and noticed that the windows in the hall were curtained, although she could have sworn they had been open yesterday. The air in the inn had grown thicker, as if someone had turned an invisible dial, and she felt her skin crawl. Leaving, Lucas's voice came from behind her, and she turned with a start. He was standing in the doorway of the bar, his shirt unbuttoned to the top button, his eyes looking at her with the same penetrating intensity that both drew her in and scared her. I need to go," she said, her voice hoarse as she backed away until she hit the door. "This place, this is all wrong." Lucas stepped closer, his smile soft but predatory. "You can't leave, Emma," he said, his voice low, almost mesmerizing. "Montauk doesn't let go of those who haven't found what they're looking for yet." Her stomach clenched, and she felt her hands begin to shake. "What are you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why do you say that? What have you been doing with other women?" He didn't answer, just looked at her, his eyes like a pool, and she felt her mind begin to blur again, as if he was pulling her into his depths. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to find a way out, and had to get out of this place that seemed to have her in its clutches. The hallway led to a narrow staircase she hadn't noticed before. It was old, with darkened wooden steps, and it led down into darkness. Emma paused, her breathing ragged, but something instinct, fear, curiosity pushed her forward. She descended, her hand sliding along the cold banister, each step a leap into the unknown. The stairs led to a heavy metal door that, to her surprise, creaked open. Beyond the door was a basement, damp and smelling of mold and something else she couldn't place. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its light weak, but enough to illuminate rows of shelves piled high with boxes, old suitcases, and bundles. Emma stepped inside, her heart pounding and her skin breaking out in a cold sweat. This place felt wrong, like it held secrets no one was supposed to know. She walked over to one of the shelves and opened a dusty suitcase. Inside were women's things. Dresses, neatly folded but faded with age. A pair of shoes, the leather cracked. A few letters, tied with a ribbon, and a photograph of a young woman whose face was eerily familiar. Emma trembled, her fingers tightening around the photograph. It was Elizabeth, the one from the diary, but her eyes were empty, as if she were staring into space. Emma opened another box, and her breath caught. There was jewelry, a bracelet engraved with Maria, 1972, a ring of tarnished silver, a pair of turquoise earrings. In the next box was another photograph, another woman, with long hair and a look of longing, and another and another. Emma felt her mind screaming, her body wanting to run, but she kept opening the boxes, her hands moving as if someone else was controlling them. Each box was like an archive, a piece of someone's life or someone's consciousness, frozen in time. She found another diary, its cover blue, with the name Clara embossed on it. She opened it, her fingers shaking, and read the first page. September 3rd, 1985. I don't know what's wrong with me. This man, he calls himself Nathan, but his eyes, they're like the sea, and I can't stop looking. He says I can be free, but I'm afraid. My dreams, they're not mine. I see her, the other woman, and she's calling me. I don't know who I am. Emma slammed the diary shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't just a coincidence. This place, this basement, Lucas, it was all part of something bigger, something she couldn't quite place but felt in every fiber of her being. She turned to leave, but her gaze fell on another box, sitting in the corner. It had her name written on it, Emma. She froze, her heart stopping, and slowly opened the lid. Inside was her blouse, the one she'd worn yesterday, and a photograph of herself standing by the sea, her face twisted with fear and desire. But she'd never had her picture taken here. Never. She screamed, her voice echoing off the walls, and ran for the door. But the door that had just been opened was now locked. She tugged at the handle, her fingers sliding over the cold metal, but nothing happened. Panic washed over her, and she began to pound on the door, her fists aching, but she didn't stop. "Open up!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Someone!" Footsteps sounded behind her, and she turned, her eyes wide with horror. Lucas stood in the doorway, his face calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "You found him," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "I knew you'd come to this." "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What are you doing? Who are you?" He stepped closer, and she stepped back, her back against the shelf. "This is Montauk, Emma," he said. "This place, it gathers, it preserves. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But you can stay, with me." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're crazy," she whispered. "I'm leaving. I'm going to find Josh, and we're going to go." Lucas smiled, but his smile was as cold as the sea. "You're not leaving," he said. "No one leaves." He held out his hand, but she pushed him away, her nails digging into his wrist, and she rushed toward the door, which now, as if by magic, opened. She ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the darkness and out into the hall, where Marge looked at her in surprise. "Emma?" she asked, but Emma didn't stop. She ran into the room where Josh was sitting on the bed, his face pale. "Josh," she breathed, her voice thick with panic. "We have to leave. Now. This place, Lucas, he's not who he says he is." Josh looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "After everything you've done," he said, his voice cold, "you think I'm just going to run after you?" "Please," she begged, her hands gripping him. "I know what I've done, but you have to believe me. This place, it's dangerous. I found things, the other women, they didn't leave." Josh frowned, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. He stood up, his movements jerky. "Okay," he said, "but if this is some kind of game of yours—" "This isn't a game," she said, her voice breaking. They grabbed their bags and ran out into the hall, but when they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge again. Emma felt her heart sink. She turned around, and Lucas was standing at the end of the hall, his eyes a beacon in the night. "You won't leave," he said, and his voice was like a storm that would never let them go. Emma stood in the hall, driftwood in, her back pressed against the cold oak door that refused to open, as if the inn had decided to hold her captive. Her breathing was ragged, and her heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst from her chest. Josh stood next to her, his face tense, his eyes full of distrust and pain, but he still held her hand, as if clinging to the remains of their marriage. Lucas stood at the end of the hall, his figure illuminated by the dim light of the fireplace, his eyes dark and impenetrable, staring at her with such intensity that she felt her will weaken. The storm outside still roared, but its roar now seemed part of this place, part of Lucas, part of her own mind, which was cracking at the seams. "Emma," Lucas said, his voice soft but steely, as if he knew every word he spoke was a blow that could break her. "You can't leave. Not now that you've finally begun to see the truth." Josh squeezed her hand tighter, his fingers digging into her skin. "What the hell is he talking about?" he growled, his voice shaking with anger. "Emma, come on. We'll find another way out." But Emma didn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor, and her gaze was fixed on Lucas. She felt his words seeping into her like poison, slowly dissolving her resolve. She remembered the basement, the boxes of other women's things, the diaries full of pain and desire, and that picture with her name on it that couldn't be real. This place, this man, they were like a web, and she was caught in it, not knowing how to get out. "What truth?" she asked, her voice hoarse, almost alien. "What do you want from me? What did you do to those women?" Lucas stepped closer, his movements slow, almost predatory. "I don't do anything they don't want," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You came here, Emma, because you were looking for something. Not Josh, not your marriage, but yourself. You were tired of pretending, tired of living in a cage you call love. I just showed you who you really are." Emma felt her chest tighten. His words were like a knife stabbing into her heart, because there was truth in them, or at least a shadow of it. She was truly tired, of the way Josh had shut her out with his phone, of the way their marriage had become routine, of how she had lost herself trying to be the wife she thought he wanted her to be. But Lucas, he wasn't a salvation, he was a trap, and she knew it. "You're lying," she said, her voice weak but determined. "You want me to think that my feelings for Josh are a lie, but they're not. I love him. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I want to give up on him." Lucas smiled, but his smile was as cold as the wind outside. "Love?" he said, his voice full of sarcasm. "You call this love? The way he ignores you? The way he looks at you like you're a piece of furniture and not a woman? I've seen you come alive, Emma. With me. You want me, you want freedom, and you're afraid to admit it." Josh let go of her hand, his face pale. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet but full of pain. "Is it true? Do you still think about him?" Emma turned to face him, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I mean, I don't know, Josh. I'm confused. But I don't want him. I want us. I want to fix what we broke. But Lucas didn't let her finish. You're lying to yourself, he said, his voice rising as if he were trying to drown out her doubts. You think you can go back to your old life, to your husband, to your cozy little world? But you're not the same anymore, Emma. You've felt what it's like to be alive. You can't forget that. You don't want to forget. His words were like waves crashing against the shore, and Emma felt them eroding her resolve. She remembered the night with him, his hands on her body, his voice whispering that she belonged to him, and the memory was like poison that still coursed through her veins. But she also remembered Josh's smile when they first started dating, his promises, his warmth that had once been her home. She looked at him, and his eyes, full of pain and hope, were like an anchor, holding her to reality. You don't know me, she told Lucas, her voice hardening. You think you can get inside my head, manipulate me, but you're wrong. I'm not your puppet, and I'm not one of those women whose stuff you keep in the basement. Lucas froze, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment she saw something new their uncertainty, maybe even fear. You don't understand, he said, his voice quieter but still menacing. This place, it chooses. It chose you. You can't just leave. Emma felt her skin crawl. She remembered the basement, the boxes of names, the photographs, the diaries. It wasn't just a collection, it was something more, like driftwood in collecting lives, souls, consciousnesses. And Lucas was part of it, his eyes, his voice, his presence seeming to penetrate her mind, trying to rewrite her. Josh, she said, turning to him, her voice full of desperation. We have to leave. Now. I know you're angry, and I know it's my fault, but please, trust me. This place, it won't let go. We have to find a way. Josh looked at her, his face tense, but he nodded. Okay, he said, his voice hoarse. But if we get out of this, Emma, we need to talk. About everything. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I promise. Lucas stepped forward, his hand reaching for her, but she pulled back, her eyes burning. Don't touch me, she said, her voice like steel. You won't have me, ever. He stopped, his face unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. She couldn't place anger, pain, or maybe something else. You're wrong, Emma, he said. You'll come back. Everyone does. Emma grabbed Josh's hand, and they ran for the stairs to their room. She didn't know how they were going to get out, but she knew she had to try. The hotel seemed to be resisting the floorboards creaked louder than usual, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, following them. They ran into the room, slamming the door, and Emma pressed herself against it, her breathing ragged. What did he mean? Josh asked, his voice full of worry. What basement? What women? Emma pulled Elizabeth's journal out of her pocket, her hands shaking. I found this, she said, her voice weak, and others, things, in the basement. There were boxes of names, pictures, clothes. It's like this place collects them. Their lives, their souls. Josh looked at her, his eyes wide. Are you serious? He asked, his voice full of disbelief, but she could tell he was starting to believe her. This is crazy, Emma. I know, she said, her voice breaking. But it's true. Lucas, he's part of this. He's trying to, I don't know, take me away, break me. But I don't want to be one of them. I want to go home, Josh. With you. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw in his eyes the Josh she loved, not the careerist with his head buried in his phone, but the man who promised to be with her forever. Okay, he said, his voice firm. We'll find a way. Together. They began to pack, their movements quick, almost panicked. Emma felt the inn watching them, its walls, its shadows, its sounds trying to hold them back. She remembered Lucas's words, you can't leave, and felt her resolve begin to weaken. But she looked at Josh, at his face, full of pain and determination, and she knew she had to fight. Not for Lucas, not for Montauk, but for herself, for them, for the life they could have back. They went down to the hall, but Lucas was there, standing by the fireplace, his eyes watching them like a predator watching its prey. You won't leave, he said, his voice calm but menacing. Montauk won't let go. Emma stepped forward, her fists clenching. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice loud, full of a power she didn't know she possessed. "And I'm not staying. We're leaving, Lucas, and you can't stop us." He looked at her, his eyes dark as the sea, but this time she didn't feel their power. She felt Josh next to her, his hand on her shoulder, and it was like an anchor, keeping her grounded in reality. They turned to the door, and this time it opened, as if the inn had finally tired of fighting. The storm was still roaring, but Emma knew this was her last battle, not with Lucas, not with Montauk, but with herself. The morning sun was filtering through the thin curtains, casting a soft, golden glow over the bedroom. Emma lay in bed, her eyes slowly opening to the warmth of familiar sheets, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen, and the weight of her own body, which finally felt like it belonged to her. She blinked, her gaze sliding around the room. The wooden dresser holding her and Josh's wedding photo, the mirror in the corner, slightly dusty, and the open window, letting in the sounds of birds chirping. There was no storm. No roar of wind, no rain on the roof, none of that ominous energy that seemed to permeate every corner. Driftwood Inch was at home. Josh lay beside her, his breathing even and his face relaxed, as if he'd slept without a care, without the pain that had marred his features in Montauk. Emma looked at him, her heart clenching with a mixture of relief and guilt. She reached out, her fingers brushing his shoulder, and he stirred, muttering something unintelligible before falling back into sleep. This was her Josh, not the one who'd looked at her with anger and disappointment, but the one who'd once promised her the world. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving, and tried to convince herself that this had all been a dream, a vivid, terrifying one, but just a dream. She stood, her bare feet touching the cool wood floor, and walked toward the kitchen, where the coffee maker hummed softly. Everything was familiar, the white ceramic mugs, the stack of newspapers on the counter, even the slight clutter that she and Josh always promised to clean up but never got around to. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, and leaned against the counter, trying to organize her thoughts. Montauk, Lucas, the basement, the journals, it all seemed distant now, like a movie she'd seen years ago. But her body still remembered the warmth of his arms, his voice whispering that she was awake, and the memory was too real to be a fantasy. She walked back into the bedroom, her gaze falling on the mirror. She paused, her reflection staring back at her, tired but familiar, with dark circles under her eyes and disheveled hair. She wanted to smile, to tell herself it was over, but her breath caught as she noticed movement over her shoulder. In the mirror, just for a split second, she caught a glimpse of Lucas, his dark eyes, his small, almost predatory smile. She spun around, her heart jumping, but the room was empty. Just Josh, still asleep, and a gentle breeze rustling the curtains. She looked in the mirror again, her hands shaking, but there was only her reflection, lonely, worried, but hers. Emma pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. It was a dream, she told herself, just a dream. But her fingers slid into the pocket of the cardigan she had thrown over her, and there, to her horror, she felt something hard. She pulled out Elizabeth's journal, its battered leather cover cold to the touch, the initials L burning in her eyes like an accusation. She trembled, her knees buckling, and she sank to the floor, her back pressed against the wall. This couldn't be real. She hadn't brought the journal home. She couldn't. She opened it, her hands shaking so badly that the pages rustled like autumn leaves. The last entry she remembered had ended with the words, "I left with him." But now there was a new page. The handwriting was different, not the neat swirls of Elizabeth's, but sharp, almost furious. It read, "You're still here, Emma. You'll never leave." Her throat tightened, and she slammed the journal shut, her breathing ragged. She looked at Josh, who had begun to stir, his eyes slowly opening. "Emma," he murmured, his voice sleepy but with a hint of concern. "Are you okay?" She forced a smile, though her lips trembled. "Yeah," she lied, her voice weak. "Just a bad dream." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual, as if he was seeing something he didn't want to acknowledge. "Let's go get breakfast," he said, standing up. "I'll make some toast." Emma nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She tucked the journal under her pillow, her fingers still shaking, and followed Josh into the kitchen. They sat at the table, eating toast and drinking coffee, and everything looked as if nothing had changed. But Emma felt something was wrong. The light in the room was too bright, the smell of coffee too strong, and Josh's voice too soft, as if he were part of the scenery rather than reality. She tried to talk to him, to ask about his plans, about his work, anything to keep herself in the moment, but her gaze kept returning to the mirror in the living room in the corner. She was afraid to go to it, afraid to see Lucas again, his eyes, his smile. She tried to convince herself that it was a dream, that Montauk, Driftwood Inn, the basement with the boxes, all of this was a figment of her imagination. But the diary under her pillow was real. Its weight, its smell, its words, all of this was too tangible to be fiction. Josh noticed her concern, his brow furrowing. "Emma, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with irritation, but there was concern in it too. "You seem off." She shook her head, her fingers tightening around her mug. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was shaking. "I just need time." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face for answers, but then he sighed and went back to his coffee. Emma knew she should tell him about Lucas, about the journal, about the basement, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something she didn't understand? Was she really home, or was this another layer of sleep, another Montauk trap that held her mind captive? She stood, her movements jerky, and walked to the mirror, her heart pounding. She forced herself to look at it, her reflection lonely, but deep in the corner, she saw him again, Lucas, his dark eyes, his smile that was both seductive and threatening. She blinked, and he was gone, but her skin was covered in goosebumps, and her breathing was ragged. "Emma?" Josh's voice came from behind her, and she started, turning around. He was looking at her, his face full of concern. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," she lied, her voice weak. "Just checking." He frowned, but didn't press the issue. They went back to breakfast, but Emma felt her mind splitting. She looked at Josh, at their house, at the light streaming through the window, and tried to convince herself that this was real, that she was home, that Montauk was behind her. But the journal under her pillow, Lucas's gaze in the mirror, her own memories, they were all like a splinter she couldn't pull out. She knew she had to make a choice. Live here with Josh in this reality that felt so fragile, or give in to the call of Montauk, of Lucas, of the part of herself that maybe had never been hers. She looked at Josh, and his eyes, warm but tired, were a beacon calling her back. But in the back of her mind, in the dark places, she could still hear Lucas's voice, whispering that she would never leave. Emma stood up, her hands gripping the edge of the table, and she took a deep breath. She didn't know if she was home or still in Driftwood Inn, caught in a storm that never ended. But she knew one thing. She had to fight for herself, for Josh, for the truth, whatever it was. She looked in the mirror again, and her reflection was lonely, but she didn't see Lucas. Maybe he was gone. Or maybe he was inside her, a part of her she could never erase. The question remained unanswered. Was she free, or did Montauk still hold her in its clutches? She took Josh's hand, her fingers tightening around his, and she smiled, but her smile was as fragile as glass. Life went on, but somewhere deep inside her, the storm still roared, and she didn't know if it would ever end. If you listen to the end, you are real heroes. Give it a like if you didn't fall asleep halfway through, and write in the comments what was the most unexpected. Subscribe, the next story is already warming up in the drafts and is ready to surprise you. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.